Good afternoon or morning to everyone across the country. We appreciate you being here with us this afternoon. And for our first of a series of webinars, Eliminating the Adverse Impact of Alcohol and Drug Use on Children and Families. On behalf of the Office for Victims of Crime, our JBS International Training and Technical Assistance Team, and our partner, Ms. Wenger, and the team at the National Association for Children of Addiction, thank you for being here with us today. Beginning in October of 2018, the Office for Victims of Crime funded projects across the country to identify early and serve children impacted by and experiencing victimization related to the opioid crisis and broader substance use. Since that time, OVC has awarded a total of 76 projects, including 9 in tribal communities and recently 1 U.S. territory in the last fiscal year project awards. The projects are incredibly diverse. Some are city and county based. Some are being implemented by legal aid service providers, while others are affiliated with direct service community-based providers across our country. Central to their collective work has been and continues to be a focus on building trauma-informed and responsive services to meet the needs of children, youth, and their families, and to promote education awareness with those who may encounter affected children so that they know how best to support them and also to connect them to services. In addition, the projects monitor local and other data to better understand the needs and gaps to inform a targeted strategy, both in the inception of their work as well as the ongoing efforts. Projects have also partnered and are building and enhancing existing multidisciplinary stakeholder partnerships to ensure that a coordinated effort and response is both acknowledged and needed, but also committed to by critical partners. And many of those critical partners, as you well know, from those of you who are working in the field, are child welfare, schools, law enforcement, first responders, public health, and so on. The work that has been and is underway is extraordinary. And I'm fortunate, as well as our team, to have the good fortune to work with OVC and the grantees, lending us a firsthand view and understanding of the work being accomplished to positively impact the lives of children along with their families and ultimately their communities. In our work as TTA providers and people who have worked in the field as clinicians and leaders and advocates, we collectively embrace our work and are committed wholeheartedly to promoting well-being for all children and families. We have witnessed firsthand the devastation that has impacted so many, and I believe that through this work, there's not only hope, but that real change has been, is, and will be achieved. With this said, our partnerships are incredibly important to us too. About a year and a half ago, I attended an event at Johns Hopkins and had the good fortune to meet Ms. Wenger, CEO of the National Association for Children of Addiction. When meeting her, I felt immediately that I had known her for years as she reached out her hand to welcome me. We spoke only briefly, but I knew that day that she was someone that I needed to know better and to learn from. Now here we are a year and a half later and many conversations later. And when I say many conversations, I mean like many conversations. We've talked on weekends, at night, we text, but we've had a lot of really good, gentle, but also just incredibly poignant conversations. And the fruits of that is this webinar that you are about to experience today, and then 4 others that follow in the series. There are just no words of gratitude sufficient to thank Ms. Wenger, her NACOA team, and the gifted colleagues and partners like Mr. Moe, who's with us today, who have so willingly giving of themselves, their time, and their expertise. And, on behalf of our team and OVC, we thank you. I hope you all have registered for each of the sessions, as each one will offer such incredible information. I would certainly encourage you, if you can't attend yourself, have someone attend, have someone join. Make sure you watch the recordings afterwards, because you just really don't want to miss this information that's being offered. Along the way, you will have ideas and offerings that can be implemented in your local areas and your local programs. And even more, you'll hear about the additional support, the training, and the TA that can be leveraged to support you in those efforts. Now I have the great honor of introducing you to Ms. Wenger, CEO of NACOA for the past 25 years. She has authored and co-authored many publications across disciplines, is a professor, a trainer, a presidential award recipient, and works tirelessly as an advocate and leader prioritizing the lives of children impacted by addiction. It is with honor I turn the floor to you, Ms. Wenger, and welcome you and offer the floor to you. So thank you, and I hope you all enjoy the webinar.
Thank you very much, Kim. It has been a joy working with you all these months, and Jerry and I and the team that follows are really pleased and anxious to speak with the people that you've been working with in your grantee programs all these years. NACOA, the National Association for Children of Addiction, called NACOA, is the voice of children, voice for the children, and has been that for almost 40 years. During that time, we have learned a great deal. Our founders had already figured out what was wrong with children who were living in addictive family systems, and on their own had created some very, very helpful, gentle programs to help ameliorate some of the pain and suffering that children of alcoholics in those days were suffering. Jerry was one of those people. And over the years, the work that they started has really caused a lot of systems change thinking that we want to talk to you about in these webinars. Eliminating the adverse impact of alcohol and drug use on children and families, the name of this series, is actually our mission, the NACOA mission. And it has been basically our mission for all these 40 years. So during today's presentation and on to the end, we will be touching on things that we have learned in the process of helping others to learn. Next slide, please. And now to introduce Jerry, who's already been partially introduced. Jerry Moe is probably one of the top, if not the top friend of the children of alcoholics all around this world. He is known all around the world. He has been gentle and committed. He has been gifted in the way he has learned to work with children. And we have all learned enormously from him. The work that he's done with small children has dramatically helped people who work with adult children of alcoholics and adult children of drug addicted people, because the PTSD and the life problems that they have received are actually started in their childhood. And Jerry's the one who nails the head every time on what we should be doing at what level for these children. Sometimes we think at NACOA that we're all a broken record. We are saying the same things after 40 years. But you know, addiction didn't change, and addiction's impact on families didn't change. The thing that we are trying to do here, and I'm going to turn it over to Jerry to start the process in a second, we are trying to get decision makers in this country, in every system that touches children, to understand that 1 in 4 children lives in a family with active addiction, and they are suffering, and they are not seen, nor are they served. And so with that, I'd like to introduce you or ask you to welcome Jerry Moe, the friend to all of us.
Thank you, Sis.
Next slide.
Hey, somebody in the chat box, let me know. How's the volume? Can you hear me really well right now? Is this good? All right, good deal. Hey, I'm delighted that you're here. Welcome to each and every one of you. Just a couple of sentences about me to give perspective in terms of the lessons that I've learned that I'd love to share with you very briefly today. So I'm a child family counselor, always in the treatment field, the alcohol and drug treatment field, over 4 decades. And today I'm here in my role as an advisory board member for the National Association for Children of Addiction. This is webinar number 1, so really a large overview. What have we learned about these boys and girls through the years? And then I'll transition and hand it back over to Sis so she can share with you some of the programs and the products that NACOA has developed through the years to help children and families in their own healing. And I'm excited and I'm grateful that I also get to tell you a little bit about some amazing boys and girls that I know. So, what do we know? Children from families hurt by addiction often first hurt, last helped, largely silent and invisible, living in families with chaos, inconsistency, and unpredictability. Chronic fear, lots of loss, infinite worry, and many, and I can't underscore this enough, many children believe that the family problems are their fault, and no one has ever explained it to them in a way that makes sense. Next slide, please. So at the National Association for Children of Addiction, for years, we've been saying 1 out of every 4 boys and girls in America is growing up in a family that's been hurt by addiction, 1 in 4. And I just want to say in passing, I think the number is even larger. I believe it's larger these days. I think if you go back over the last half dozen years and look at the opioid, heroin, fentanyl epidemic, the numbers swell. I'd even venture to say that over the last 15 months with the coronavirus pandemic and the isolation that's taken place for all family members, where mental health difficulties have been swirling, where people turn to alcohol and drugs to medicate some of those things, I think the numbers are even larger than 1 out of 4. But what we can be really clear about is there is a multi-generational cycle that addiction gets passed from generation to generation to generation. Where does it stop? 3 brief points about this before we move on. Point number 1, it's not just the addiction that gets passed along multi-generationally. It's the trauma. It's the violence. It's having family members incarcerated. It's the child maltreatment. That also gets passed along. When we're talking about children, boys and girls, the age group that I work with, largely 7 to 12-year-olds, they're at risk for addiction. Is there a genetic basis? Absolutely there is. Really strong in the science. We know that addiction tends to run in families. Biological predisposition. It's in the jeans, the slacks, the shorts, the skirt, whatever it is you're wearing, it's somewhere in there. But I want to be clear about one thing. What boys and girls inherit is not addiction. What they inherit is the biological vulnerability to it. And it's not just genetics. Environment plays a huge part in this process. And let me tell you about a family of 3 kids to make this point, and we'll move along. So in a children's program, 12-year-old boy, 9-year-old girl, 7-year-old boy coming in the first morning with Spanish. This is like the children's program kit, which you'll be introduced to, and celebrating families that works with the entire family system. Just similar, build a relationship with boys and girls. And it's not into that second session that we even begin to talk about the addiction that's going on in a family. And we're doing introductions. The 12-year-old says his name and how old he is, and he's here because mom promised him a video game if he attended. Okay, that's all right. Go around the group to the 9-year-old, little girl who's very quiet. You could barely hear her voice sitting on the edge of my chair. And she says her name and how old she is. And just says, sometimes there's awful fighting in my family with mom and dad, and I get scared. And she's sitting next to an incredible counselor named Carol and just grabs onto her. We go around the group, and Jeffrey, I called him Jeffy, he was 7. He was the last to share. If I've learned one thing, if you create safety, build relationship, often the youngest member of the family is closest to the truth. And he starts out and says, let me tell you what happens in my family. My daddy goes into the bathroom and he's in there for like an hour and he never flushes. And I smell smoke in the bathroom. I smell smoke. And I'm thinking, okay, dad is smoking drugs in the bathroom. And I don't know who told this to this little guy or if he made up the story himself, but he said, and then the door opens and an alien comes out in my dad's body. Jerry Moe, it's an alien. And he hits my mom. He hits her. And now I'm looking across at his brother who's got his hands in his face. And he says, my big brother sometimes tries to go get help, but dad grabs him before he can get to the door. And my sister goes in her closet and I hide under the bed. And I'm not coming out until the alien is gone. I won't come out. Oh, my goodness. Just spilling out all over the place. And he looked at me, couldn't even remember my name, and just said, hey, mister, could you help me? Could you help my family? Biological predisposition, psychological hurt and pain, trauma. What a powerful combination. And without assistance, without help, without opportunities for healing, how many more generations does this take place? Last comment. You're going to be hearing during the second webinar all about celebrating families. A great child-centered family program. Help for the whole family. And it was my dear friend Sis Wenger, first person who said this. I call it a Velcro message. One of those messages you can't even knock out. It's just so powerful. And she said this, often the only difference between the children and the grown-ups in a family program is that the children today are getting help. Thank goodness, it is about time. But what she also said is the difference is the grown-ups are yesterday's children that nobody helped. Yesterday's children that no one helped. Yesterday's children. Next slide, please. Instead of me telling you all about these boys and girls, I'd like them to tell you a little bit because they're the experts in all of this. In artwork, you'll see it in the children's program kit that will be in webinar number 3. You'll hear about it next session with Celebrating Families. And the key to the artwork, though, is teaching boys and girls how to separate the person they love, whether it's mom, dad, brother, sister, grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle, all of the above, how to separate them from the disease that consumes them. Because kids see this and separating those two. And what I've learned through the years is I put children in a dilemma when I ask them, tell me about your mom's use of prescription medication. Talk about dad's pain pills. Talk about your sister drinking alcohol, because in essence, I've created a dilemma where I'm asking them to betray and be disloyal to the very people that they love. But if you switch it around and ask them to talk about the disease, the disease that wreaks havoc on the entire family and takes everybody hostage, and just really consumes and envelops the people they love. A 12-year-old girl one time in a children's program said, you know what I learned today? Addiction turns the people we love into strangers. So take a look at this first picture done by a young boy. And there's his family and addiction and families being torn apart. And in this particular family, they were, and the boys and girls we work with are so incredibly diverse in all circumstances. But this particular family had a lot of money. And I'll tell you, my experience with money and addiction, it allows a disease to continue to grow and flourish. Because sometimes people can buy their way out of things. And even though their money and their high-powered attorneys, they were no longer able to take care of their kids. And Children's Protective Services came in one day and took them. How has addiction hurt our family? It's torn us apart. And look at the bottom. Everybody's crying. Everybody gets taken hostage. Next slide, please. Look at this picture done by a young girl. And I'll tell you, look how big the beer bottle is. And it's got arms and legs. And look how it's going downhill. And there's dad, and it became very clear in the program that dad had a problem with alcohol, alcohol use disorder. And I wasn't sure about mom. And in this particular case, I asked, well, what about mom? Is mom running to the bottle too? And the little girl said, no way, Jerry. Mom is running as fast as she can. She's going to tackle dad before he can get to the alcohol bottle. And look at the dynamics. And please look at those two kids. Look at that beautiful little girl and her big brother. Look at them. In the dance of development, when parental attention is focused elsewhere, often there's no partner for the dance. Kids dance alone. And as Sis said, and grow up and try to figure out what normal is. Next slide, please. Very simple picture done by a little girl. How has addiction hurt your family? And again, if kids want to share with the group, we let them. They don't have to. But when we do, then other boys and girls can make comments and they can ask questions and relate and have feelings about. And this beautiful little one said, that's the part of my heart that belongs to my mom. And there's the part of my heart that belongs to my dad. And my heart hurts. I don't know what to do, but my heart hurts. Next slide, please. Here is a great example of the opioid, heroin, fentanyl epidemic as told by a 12-year-old boy. Start in the middle on the left-hand side as you're looking at your screen, the left-hand side. And here is a dad who got into a terrible car accident, had been in recovery 4 or 5 years, terrible car accident. Look at the pain pills he's taking much more than he needs. Bottom there is mom talking to dad and being worried about how many pills he's taken, about how it's messing with his recovery. And there's dad about to hit mom. Look at the domestic violence that's there. And then all of a sudden go across to the bottom right-hand side. And there's dad, and he can't get the opioids anymore, so he's turning to heroin. And sometimes on the street, fentanyl. And the police come, go up to the right-hand top, and there's dad. That's jail. That's how he drew jail. Dad is in jail. And then dad gets out. Never again, he promised. And this cycle just continuing again. As I was looking at this morning, I was introduced to an addiction psychiatrist. Sis will remember this name. His name was Dr. Joe Persh, all the way back to the 1980s. And Dr. Perch one day said in a lecture that I went to, you know what? We either repeat or we recover. There's no middle ground. We either continue, how many more generations, or healing begins to take place and things change. Last slide of artwork anyway. One more. Yeah. So how has addiction hurt our family? There's 2 girls, 11 and 7. And it's after school, and their moms had a problem with prescription drugs and with alcohol. And they knock on the door ever so lightly, and mom's not responding. They don't know if she's okay. They don't know what's going on. The sheer terror that she described. And afterwards I said, well, gosh, what about dad? Could you call dad? If I call dad at work, he's going to come home and yell at mom, and then maybe they won't stay together, and I'm not sure what to do. I am just so very, very scared in all of this. Let the children tell the story. Next slide, please. What we know is this is a family disease. And you are in for an incredible treat in webinar number 5, Dr. Claudia Black, who to me is the pioneer in the treatment of children and adolescents and adults who come from families hurt by addiction. And in her groundbreaking book, just a new edition of it has come out. With more insights and lessons that Claudia has learned. Look at the bottom right-hand side. What do kids learn? Don't talk. Don't trust. And don't feel. Family laws of addiction that to this day still resonate. Don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. And the amazing thing for me is when I work with boys and girls, when I use a children's program kit, when kids go to Celebrating Families and all the other wonderful materials that Sis is going to share with us in just a few minutes, what am I asking boys and girls to do? Trust me. Talk to me. Tell me how you feel, whether you draw it, write it, say it, the exact opposite of what's allowed them to survive. And I am amazed at how quickly boys and girls do that. They'll break those family rules as long as you can provide safety and ongoing care, not just for them, but for the whole family. Next slide. Let's talk about solutions. Let me just, and I want to really talk about the NACOA approach. I call it the NACOA approach. 40 years in all of its products, in all of its programs. It's a strength-based process. It's building resilience. It's reducing the risks. And isn't it fascinating when you look at the scientific literature on boys and girls growing up in families hurt by addiction? What you'll see all the time is these boys and girls are referred to as kids at risk. Kids at risk. And yet by shifting the balance and creating protective factors, teaching boys and girls three critical things that we'll get to next: information, skill building, and bonding and attachment, is upping their resilience. So children at risk can become children of promise. So important. And those three areas, let me just briefly touch on them. And I'll tell you in the next slide, please. And in the next 4 webinars, you'll be seeing this more and more. So information that is accurate and age appropriate, and education on addiction. When boys and girls experience trauma in their lives, my clinical experience, and especially the trauma around addiction and all the things that are related to the addiction, and no one explains it to them in an age-appropriate way, boys and girls make up a story for it all to make sense. And unfortunately, 3 things with that story. Number 1, it tends to be egocentric. So it's about me. It's about me. And little kids developmentally are at the hub of the universe. Secondly, it's an erroneous story. It's off base. And thirdly, without some kind of intervention, I see those stories that kids tell themselves about trauma as little kids. I see them becoming life scripts for adults, adolescents and adults, that really inhibit and thwart all human growth and development and potential. I want to change that narrative. I want to help boys and girls to see that it's not their fault and they're not to blame. And that boys and girls don't make the people they love drink or use drugs. And unfortunately, they can't make them stop. It's those first 3 C's of our 7 C's. I didn't cause it. I can't control it. I can't cure it. When Sesame Street came to NACOA, Sesame Street came to NACOA for NACOA's help on its parental addiction initiative. The amount of time that Sis and I and a few others spent on working on a script and choosing each word very carefully, deliberately, methodically on how to explain this to boys and girls, to get them to see that it's not their fault. An example, and we'll move on. And I'm going to wrap up my part of this in just about the next 8 or 9 minutes. Now, everything that we've done, everything that I've done children's program-wise in the last 15 months has been virtual. We've had to shift, and I've really been surprised, quite honestly. Can you teach an old dog new tricks? Yeah, but it's difficult. But I really see the place that virtual services has moving forward. There was a young girl. Her dad was in treatment. So one of the places we can bring these programs are to treatment centers, all levels of care. And the dad who was in treatment wasn't sure if this virtual program, using activities that you learn about from the children's program kit. And so the compromise was his daughter, who's 11, was going to participate the first day. 2 hours into a 3-hour presentation, reading a story, I was there. And the story was about a character learning for the first time that her parents' addiction was not her fault. Now, no one had ever told her it was. No one had ever even implied that. But the story that she made up, she made it about herself. And when we're reading and the character is letting this in, that it's not my fault, she went out of camera view. Now, fascinatingly enough, she didn't turn off the camera. Camera stayed on, just couldn't see her. And I noticed that she was unmuted, and I swear that I could hear some muffled crying in all of that. When we finished the story, we asked some questions, and I asked her if she'd come back on camera. And she sat up, 11 years old. Oh, just an incredible young lady. And she's wiping the tears from her cheeks. And she looks in the camera and said, "Do you mean to tell me that every time my dad relapses, that's not because of me? And are you saying that when my parents fight and say ugly things and say they're not going to stay together, I didn't do anything to make that happen? And when my dad breaks promises and I get disappointed, it wasn't something that I said or did?" Exactly. That's exactly what we said. Just that basic information. We finished up the virtual program. That was it. About 3 weeks later, the dad calls me. He just got back home on the East Coast, and he said, "You're not going to believe what happened." So when I got home last night, the person I had the most trepidation of seeing was my daughter. Because if I learned one thing in treatment, is how much my disease has hurt her. And then I'm reliving what happened when I was a little kid growing up with this disease. She says, "I went into the house, my daughter ran across the room and hugged me. She hugged me, she would not let go. And she said, 'Jerry, you need to understand, the last couple of years, she just distanced herself from me. That's her coping strategy.' And when she finally let go, she looked at me and said, 'Oh, I'm so proud of you, Dad. Thank you for going to get help. Now I understand. And maybe if we all work together, we can keep addiction out of our house.'" So children's programs just don't help children. That dad said for the first time he could let go of some of the guilt and the shame that he's been carrying around. Children's programs can positively impact everyone in the family. Next slide, please. Skill building. NACOA products, NACOA programs, skill building, healthy living skills, problem solving skills, communication skills, how to handle stress, how to make friends, coping strategies, self-care mechanisms, learning about safe people, and having the group, a children's program kit group, the Celebrating Families or Celebrando Familia in Spanish. Those groups can be a safe place for boys and girls to practice those skills and to deepen them and work with them. There's a children's program kit being used in an elementary school, another place. These programs can flourish as part of student assistance programs. A few years back, little girl there, 9 years old, her name was Becky. And through a couple of activities that you learn about in the children's program kit, Many People Can Help Me and Safe People and Helping Hands, she has a terrible tummy ache at lunch and goes to see the school nurse. She goes to see the nurse. And what she tells the nurse is, "I am so scared right now. My mom didn't come home last night, and I'm not sure where she is." Instead of holding all of that in, telling the school nurse who called her aunt, her mom's sister who was on the emergency form and coming and getting her. It's the kind of skill building that we're talking about. And next slide, please. And bonding and attachment, the key to all of this. That sense of belonging. Please never forget that this is a disease of isolation, silence, secrecy, shame, and stigma. Not just for the person with the substance use disorder, but for the entire family, including kids. And isn't it ironic? 1 out of every 4 kids, and yet so many of them believe they're the only one. So being in a group with other kids just like them, and bonding and belonging and growing and comparing notes, a huge part of this entire process that we're working on. That's the key. And the presence of at least one nurturing adult in their lives comes from all of the research that Dr. Emmy Werner, W-E-R-N-E-R, Dr. Emmy Werner created, present around resilience, often called the grandmother of resilience. That sense of belonging, that kids don't care about how much you know until they know about how much you care. And having a place that's safe where you belong and it's okay to be yourself is incredibly powerful in this whole dynamic. Next slide. I would never just show you pictures of how kids get devastated by substance use disorder without showing you when people get better. And so in these slides, kids are asked, how do we know we're getting better? And this beautiful little girl in the black dress, and you share with her sister, mom, and grandma, they all live together. How do we know we're getting better? Nice words. That in our families now, people are saying nice words. Even when dad isn't a part of the equation right now, they continue to go on and heal. Next slide, please. How I feel now, my emotion bag. Having ways to begin to communicate more about what's going on in my life and being in a group with other kids going through the same thing. It's an activity that we'll tell you about in webinar number 3 called the Bag of Rocks. Next slide, please. Another example. Here is a young boy, can't wake up mom early in the evening. What does he do? Who are my safe people? Hello, grandpa. Can you help me, please? Giving skills and tools that work. Next slide, please. Before TNR, and in children's programs speak, TNR stands for treatment and recovery. So before TNR, look at the little girl. It's all my fault. That's her thought bubble. And look at after TNR, when families all participate. Mom, dad, daddy, me, and how things can shift in all of this. And then the last piece of artwork. My dad is in recovery, me too. In October of 2015, at the National Mall in Washington, D.C., there was a rally, Unite to Face Addiction, Rally for Recovery. And it was a result of NACOA creating these placards that were distributed, and the number of people that were there that day celebrating family recovery, whole families being given an opportunity to heal and to share. Next slide. So I want you to remember, one of the first words I said, yes, addiction tends to run in families, but recovery runs in families too. With products and programs, we can turn that corner and give people help, hope, and healing. And that's truly what this is all about. And so my final slide. And just a note of caution. And we'll move on, and I'll hand the baton to Sis. And one of our thought leaders at NACOA, Dr. Tion Dayton, will be talking a lot about this. I believe it's in webinar number 4. But I want you to know, while this work is exhilarating, it's also emotionally exhausting. And it's so important for people who do this as volunteers, as professionals, as teams, to have plenty of opportunities for self-care. I look at it this way. Children come to a program or to one of your sessions, and it's, I hold up this cup, please drink from my cup. Understanding, love, information, some skill building, bonding and attachment. Please drink from my cup. Some kids will take it, they'll drink the whole thing and say, more, please. I want some more, please. And the idea is, when we're not working with boys and girls and their families in a trauma-informed way, need to have ways to fill this cup back up. And whether it's through supervision and my own support system and self-care, ways for me to unplug and do this work, so that when I am doing it, I've got something to give that some boys and girls are so incredibly thirsty for. And I'm going to leave my remarks right there and turn them over to my dear friend and colleague, Sis. It's wonderful to get to do this with you today, the president and CEO of the National Association for Children of Addiction and our biggest advocate. Sis, all yours.
You know, so much good has come out of the stories that you tell. You tell about one child, you can often teach 10 lessons with it. Every one of the lessons that you did in this presentation reminds me of all the adult decision makers in this country who impact all of those children, whether they're impacting them in the child welfare system, whether they're impacting them in the school, in the divorce court, in the juvenile justice court. People are making decisions about the children that Jerry has just described. And every one of them are being missed in most cases until we have established intervening kind of projects. And what I want to talk to you today about is sort of the way that NACOA has thought for these nearly 40 years. Next slide, please. Most of you have learned a lot about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. We had the privilege of bringing the CDC leader of that to Washington to introduce people who are working in organizations like SAMHSA to learn about this study and to rethink how we approach prevention. When you think about those children that Jerry's talking about, we're talking about adverse childhood experiences. And the thing that I worry about, that lots of people are worried about, is not only the immediate need to help the child understand so that they will stop suffering and be safer, but the disrupted neural development has lasting effects. And so when we impact with chronic emotional stress the neurological development of small children, we understand how we got to PTSD in the middle life, how we got to troubled adolescence, how we got to more suicides with one population, the population of who grew up in these families. So what we're trying to do at NACOA, and in many other organizations as well, is to continually point to it has to happen by others. It doesn't come from inside the child. What's going on with the children are the emotional stress and the emotional perspectives that they have when they are in that triangle marching up the ACEs. So what are they thinking and what is stressing them? Well, Jerry's touched on a lot of it. The ones that they can't see that anybody cares. That something's wrong with their parents and they worry about them. Sometimes they worry that their parents are going to die. They don't worry about their drinking. They worry about losing them. And then they are scared. They're upset. All of these things create added adverse childhood experiences. For many of these children, the chronic emotional stress starts when they're born and continues through their entire childhood in the families that never get help or that never break up and start over again. So they're going through all of this, and each day that they're building on the impact of the adverse childhood experiences that they're going through. And so the longer it happens, the more repair work that will be needed for them. At the same time, the longer it happens, the more it will impact other people who are close to them. And that whole family cycle continues to grow. So we think at NACOA, we have thought for a number of years that we need to find a way to raise awareness among the people who make decisions about children. And let me start that part by introducing you to the Lending a Hand video from Sesame Street. This was one of the first ones that grew out of our project with them on parental addiction.
Catch me, try to catch me.
Thanks, Chris, for watching me and Elmo while my mom's at her meeting.
Yeah. Oh, of course, it's no problem. I'm always happy to help her out. She's a good friend.
What meeting does Cody's mommy have to go to?
Well, buddy, Carly's mom has been having a hard time. So in order to help her get better, she goes to a meeting with her group. They all sit in a circle.
Oh, Elmo likes singing circle time in school. Oh, does Carly's mommy sing songs in a circle? No, they talk about grown-up problems. She goes every day so that she stays healthy. You see, well, my mom needs help learning to take better care of herself, so she talks to people with the same problem.
You see, buddy, everybody there is having the same kind of hard time. So they talk with each other about it.
Oh, well, when Elmo talks about a problem that Elmo's having, it helps Elmo feel better. Well, me too. And so I go to a special kids-only meeting. Our parents all have the same problem. We sit in a circle, and at the end, we hold hands and we sing. Well, Elmo really likes holding hands with his friends.
You know, holding the hand of a friend can really help you feel better.
Yeah, sure can. Hand in hand.
Come here, guys.
Well, what NACOA is trying to do and encouraging Sesame Street and others to do is to get people to talk. Now, this little girl her name is Carly. She shows up in a number of other videos and a resource that is very rich, and many of your grantee programs would be able to use them well in the work that they're doing. But the message here is that we have to talk and we have to raise awareness. Our philosophy is that we need to raise awareness about addiction, the true nature of addiction and what it does to the individual, to the children, and to families. And we can't teach enough of it. And even little children like Carly need the information, but they need it at a level that they can understand. They also need what Jerry's been talking about, the support groups that we will be talking about also again in the third session. Little Carly's going to group as part of her mother's treatment. But think about this for 1 minute. Only 5% of the children in this country have an opportunity to get that kind of help at that point in their lives with the right kind of information. So why are we focusing so much on the children when all of the political decisions and all of the funding that's coming out because of the opioid epidemic and other addiction issues, nothing seems to be coming out for children? Well, there are so many of them, 1 in 4 suffering in silence. Grandparents are now raising grandchildren that Jerry mentioned that. He mentioned the trauma and the abuse and the neglect. If we don't help decision makers understand that, not just report the numbers, but understand what is happening individually to children in these families, they will never move on to be empathetic enough to step up. Jerry talked about what it's like to do this work. It's difficult sometimes, but it is also very rewarding. But it does develop empathy. And if we can develop enough empathy, we will begin to understand that it's time to take action. But there is no action, no concern when there is no empathy in a problem like this. So information, giving lectures on how the brain works, and information on what addiction is like clinically and scientifically is important. But if we are going to get people we're working with and programs like the grantees on this project are working with, they need to have a deep understanding of the nature and the destructive nature of parental addiction so that they can do the uncomfortable thing and break those rules that Jerry was talking about. One of the things that Sesame Street Project has done is come up with big ideas to break out all the things that we've been talking about in interventions for children. So the big idea is that the children are the first hurt and the last help, and something needs to be done about that. So something that needs to be done is early intervention, prevention programs, like we're going to be talking about more in this work. Early intervention also dramatically promotes resilience that Jerry's already introduced to you. No question about it that the resilience is promoted with the younger and younger intervention. Next slide, please. The next big idea is that recovery happens in relationships. If you think about all the support of 12-step programs, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Al-Anon, Alateen, the reason they work is because like persons are sharing with and working on problems with each other. So they don't go off alone. They go out of treatment and go off into a quiet place and have no relationships. That's no way to have genuine long-term recovery. Happy life happens in relationships. Recovery, which is very challenging for every member of the family, still happens in relationships. And what is the original relationship for all of us? It's family. So we need to understand, however, that it varies. What is needed varies age to age. What Jerry has described to you for younger children is absolutely a powerful way to help them to feel okay, no matter what happens to their family. Next slide, please. For adolescents, they need to have more teenage kind of connection. Alateen is terrific for them. Even though addiction tends to run in the family, they need to learn that the children need to recover and they deserve to recover. And that seems to be lost even on much of the recovering community. That in our tremendous work in the recovery movement that's been going on now for several years, headed up by Faces and Voices of Recovery, that entire movement recognizes that the children need help, but it has not found a way to make it inclusive. And for you who are working in community projects, that might be something to add on with what you are trying to do, to add on the idea that how educational support for these children can change the whole family system and therefore ultimately change the community. So understanding the consequences of the family is what we're saying means that we have to break down the don't talk, don't feel, don't trust rules that Claudia Black has taught us so well. Talking means not gossiping. It means naming what is happening. It means expressing concern. It means learning about the disease and making sure that whatever program you are doing in your community that would come under the category of prevention, drug abuse prevention, drug use prevention, addiction prevention, no matter what it is, to leave out the children is to be missing a piece of the required action. So please remember this. Doing nothing and saying nothing is never neutral. Doing nothing, saying nothing means that the colleague that you have at your church that you recognize as getting intoxicated frequently and is having problems, and you don't say anything because you want to be nice. We make it nice for alcoholics and drug addicted people. We make it nice for them until their death. Intervention is a gift. Intervention is love. Intervention is help. But saying nothing and just being polite and covering has never helped a single person with an alcohol or drug problem. So we need to remember that too. We need to talk about it. We need to talk about how pervasive it is. We need to talk about how difficult it is for the children not to be able to trust adults. Talking breaks the silence. So when the silence is broken, and broken with feeling, with caring, with generosity, the children and families will have a much better chance. Next slide, please. Jerry referenced the 7 C's, which he has a lot of credit to his name on it. When we have learned that no matter what we're doing, whether we're working with the faith community or with social work community or with teachers, that if we keep reminding everybody that their role is to break those rules and to remember the 7 C's, and if children can get those concepts ingrained into their psyche, they will have a much better chance of being able to discern what is right, what is not, what is safe, what is not, who will help them and who will not. And so they're handy little, it's a handy poster, and they are handy rules. And if we say, does it do this? Does the action we're taking break at least one of those rules? Just one. But if it's not breaking a rule, we want to reevaluate what we're planning to do. But the focus is on the children. Jerry talked about their being egocentric. Of course they are when they're young. And so they start feeling a lot better when they are empowered. And the 7 C's help that to happen, that they can be empowered. Next slide, please. And Sesame Street actually took that to heart, and they made a little drawing and coloring post for the children to play when they're learning the 7 C's. So that's an activity that can be done in an elementary school to learn about it, learn about addiction, learn about the 7 C's, empower the children with the 7 C's, and that can be one of their activities. So next slide, please. The big idea, again, toxic family characteristics really influence the family and influence people with addiction. Most of us have grown up with an attitude in society when we are recognizing that someone has a drinking or a drug problem, some kind of a drug disorder, that we tend to believe that they lie in order to continue to use. And so for as long as I've been in this field, people have talked about denial and talked about it in a negative way, judgmentally. But if you stop to think where denial comes from, and you look at the brain research that is out today, it's become very clear that addiction is a brain-based disease. It puts the brain in hock. It takes healthy decision-making away from the person, and it causes them to be sincerely deluded. That's in a way a chemical reaction, but a biological reaction. But the brain is the brain of a person who's suffering from sincere delusion, and so they are not lying; they are deluded. When they denial, they believe that you're wrong, and that they have it right. And so as a result, in order to survive, they minimize things, they project everything out. The children that Jerry talked about, you can see the results of the projection that happens from addicted people and from sometimes the spouse, where the children get blamed for what's going on. And then at the end of the day, when we love our friends and our cousins and our neighbors who seem to be in trouble, and we try to help and they rationalize it, and we shut up. But we can't shut up. We need to continue to teach about, to talk caringly about the pervasiveness of addiction in our communities, in our churches, in our schools, actually in our country. In the last few days, I've been in grocery stores several times because I'm getting ready for a family reunion. And I have been stunned at the percentage of shelving that has been taken from food to booze. Another wonderful outgrowth of the pandemic. And I look at all that booze and say, that is not just for It's the 4th of July party. That is the drinking at home and causing more damage to children. When the pandemic hit, Jerry and I got on the phone and said, we need to try and do something to tell people how bad this is for these children. And what we really were trying to do is to get any caring adult to pay attention and to reach out to children that they might know who are suffering from a parental addiction. And in the process of doing that, they could help to minimize the impact, because children already were struggling when they go home before the pandemic. Children with addicted parents had addicted parents, and they had all the negativism and danger that comes from that we've already been talking about. But they at least 5 days a week got to school where they're intuitively, they know at least one person, and often many persons, who were trustworthy, who were predictable, who provided safety for children, who cared. And so there was a reprieve every day when they went to school. We used to hear stories at NACOA after the winter holidays, after New Year's, kids went back to school, and people were telling stories about how wonderful the holidays were. And how did these children feel? They were just glad it was over, because once again, the promises had been made and they were not kept. It was not a happy holidays. Next one, please. So we can all do these little things, and we should teach the people in our programs to do these little things, to bring it up in casual conversation, to talk about the 1 and 4, to talk to the coaches in the youth programs if you have children in school, to take a look at some of the pamphlets that we could share with you and others can, and put them in the pamphlet rack, put the posters up with the small sayings like ONDCP did with Nicole one year. They did a major campaign of awareness on children of alcoholics. And that was during the week of COA week in February. And one of the posters said, so you're afraid to bring people home from school, because you don't know what you're going to see. Find someone you trust and talk to them. The whole message was, it's not your fault, and there are safe people you can talk to. But that was probably the first time that thousands of people across this country saw a sign like that. Because when you're working with ONDCP, you get thousands out, which was wonderful. But we really need to do that kind of thing consistently. And why? Because doing nothing and saying nothing is never neutral. And as Jerry mentioned to you, one caring and trusted adult can change the trajectory of a child's life. So next slide, please. So our point has been for at least 30 of those 40 years that we needed to have accurate information with practical recommendations to help. And so in our early years, we did position statements. This is a position statement about the children in foster care. The vast majority of children in foster care in this country are there because of addiction in the family from whence they came. We published this book, and we still have many of them that people would like. The leading voices for children of addicted parents, all donated one of their favorite pieces. And we published 2 volumes, actually, of children of alcoholics selected readings, making it possible for a few more people to understand. And we did fact sheets to make it possible for people who are making decisions to not only get practical information, but also to know the scientific base. All of that was cited. Next page, please. Next, please. We began to do educational programs with partners. We partnered with Marvel Comics and produced these posters that were sent in a package to every elementary school in the country. And this was in the 80s. And what we were telling everybody was that some moms and dads drink too much and it hurts. I think you heard that from Jerry over and over again. And it said to all of them, if you want to learn more, ask someone you trust. The disease of addiction has different drugs and different behaviors sometimes related to those drugs, but the disease is the same disease. Parental addiction is the same as it was 40 years ago, as it was 100 years ago. 40 years ago, we began to talk about it. We are still talking, and we are still not getting enough adults wanting to put these kinds of posters up in their offices, in their classrooms, in their communities organizations. So but we're still thinking this way. I'm going to ask you to change the next slide, please. Next slide, thank you. And then that seemed to be so effective at the time. We partnered with the National Committee for the Prevention of Child Abuse and produced a separate special Spider-Man comic book. Thousands and thousands of them went out to the schools across the country. And in it, Spider-Man introduced the tragedy of verbal abuse on children. Next, please. When we worked with ONGCP, this was the other poster that we had. And you think it's your fault. You have parents who drink too much, you think it's your fault. Think again, it's not. And someone you trust, you should talk to about it. Those posters, again, went across the country. So, but messages don't last forever. They need to be frequent. So we spend every year on Children of Alcoholics and Children of Addiction Week trying to repeat these kinds of things to keep on reminding people. It's part of the talking about the issue, to state the problem, the implied pain and loss that children's feeling, and then give them a solution. Talk to someone you trust. Some of these children don't know that there are adults you can trust. So a poster like this can help them to learn that. Next, please. This is a pamphlet that went with that group. This is the inside of the pamphlet. And what we want to say to you about this is if every child of a parent with addiction learns and understands what this one sheet is saying and follows it and remembers that they need to talk about it, they probably will turn out pretty well, and they might not be likely to drink or use drugs because they can remember that it's not their fault, it's a disease, they didn't cause it, and that they deserve help for themselves. So the 7 C's we try to carry through every communication for young people, feeling that that's something that they can remember. Next slide, please. And finally, on the topic of products, the Spider-Man and the hero posters were in that folder, Children of Alcoholics, Meeting the Needs of Young COAs in the School Setting. You're going to hear more about that kind of thing through student assistance with Ellen Morehouse on the 4th session. Be sure to tune in with her. Next slide. Then we moved into, NACOA moved from those kinds of campaigns, awareness campaigns, into developing products that serve the children. And you're going to hear all about celebrating families next week. So I'm going to just remind you, we moved into, in the last 15 years or so, we started moving into developing products that, and then training people to use them so that they could have the responsibility to sustain programs that will help children and cause much more resilience than pain. Next slide, please. And next week, Jerry and I will be with you on the Children's Program Kit. This is the one that he referenced several times a little bit ago. So let's move on to the next one. NACOA, about 15 years ago, went through a soul searching of how we operate and what we can do to make a difference. And we concluded that we needed to establish initiatives that picked certain systems that made a difference in the lives of children over and over and over again. And in that retreat, the board decided that we needed to educate primary care providers, especially pediatricians, social workers, educators, and faith communities. That each of those categories have enormous power if they know what it's like for these children and they know what they can do about it without totally disrupting what they do anyway. And so we began to look at those systems, and the board decided that the first one would be the primary care providers. And out of that grew a fascinating project where the heads of all the family and pediatric medical groups in the country were invited to come to Hopkins for a day. And on that day, we explained to them what it was like for these children and asked them to tell us how we could help them to provide education to help these physicians be able to find and act on the problems with these children. And those doctors that came together concluded that they needed to establish, and they asked us to facilitate it. They needed to establish core competencies as a guide for their education programs and for their practice programs to address the needs of children of substance abusing parents. Next slide, please. These are some of the outcomes of that. One was a full supplement of Pediatrics, the academic magazine for pediatricians, a manual on how to operate in your office, and this is one of NIAAA's publications about the science around children of alcoholics. Next slide, please. We also, on the social work initiative, we brought together the heads of many of the top social work medical or graduate schools and practicing social workers to determine what should be the core competence for them. An extensive report from their office, and it's available to any of you on our website, or you could email NACOA for that. Next slide, please. You're going to hear a lot about student assistance. This is part of our education initiative. SAMHSA came to us and asked us if we would write a handbook on student assistance because we've done so much work in that area. And that is also available on our website. Next slide, please. This little lady, some of the most empowering words are, "Gee, I'm not the only one." I have heard that from so many young people that have gone to Alateen or gone into a student assistance support group for the first time, amazed at the children that they thought were so cool, who had worse problems than they did. And that takes me back to, please remember that recovery happens in relationships. And that's true for the very young children like Carly the puppet and like this young lady. Next slide, please. This is from a partnership that we had with the Addiction Policy Forum, a whole toolkit for educators. The next slide, please. And I'm going to be covering this on the fourth day. Is an introduction to our faith community. It's been the longest running initiative. At the top here is a manual of a course that can be done in a faith community. It can be done in a community. It can be done with any group of adults and young adults. The handbook in front here, Spiritual Caregiving, is for the professor who uses the course, and there's credit for it. Next slide, please. This is from the seminary part of our curriculum and the core competency developments. We brought leaders from all the major faith communities and seminaries together for 2 days. They developed the core competencies for clergy and other pastoral ministers. And now, 12 years later, we are still developing programs for that. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Keep going, please. These are all from some of the pictures from the faith community. And finally, back to why we are focusing on COAs. We ask you all to look at your programs that you're doing right now, some of the wonderful ones I have read about in the grantee programs, and ask yourselves, are you forgetting the children? Are you setting up something that can go on when you're gone, that gives them tools and training that they can do themselves to help them not only to gain the understanding necessary for empathy, but to pass that ability to understand and to care on to your colleagues? And with that, next slide, please. And I think we can skip this because it's running late, but I will tell you this is about Elmo's father telling him about addiction. Thank you very much. Are there questions?
Ms. Wenger, yes, we did receive a couple questions and comments via the chat. So I'm going to read the first one. How can a child or teenager who has one parent in recovery be helped when the other parent is not? I've experienced this situation twice, and in both instances, the teenagers were self-harming and were encouraged to see me by my parent in recovery.
Jerry, I'm going to let you have that one.
Okay, Sis, I'll be glad to. So, Peter, excellent question that often happens, and that is when one parent is in recovery and the other is not. You know, there is an incredible there's an incredible book written by Dr. Stephanie Brown. It's called The Alcoholic Family in Recovery, where it's an actual research study done about what happens in the family over the course of years with recovery. They address this topic about one parent in recovery, the other not. But what Dr. Brown also talks about is the trauma of early recovery. It's not going back to an old life, it's starting a brand new life. And so I would concur in that. I think it's real important for the child or the adolescent to be able to see someone individually. And not just around the addiction, but I think just a conflict between those two parents, and often, you know, children and adolescents being stuck in the middle of all of that. So, and especially if self-harm is coming up, I would want that child to, or that adolescent to be assessed and evaluated for ongoing care. But seen individually by a skilled clinician would be my first option in terms of how to proceed moving forward. Secondary one, and it's really secondary, Peter, would be for that young person maybe to attend some Alateen meetings, and these days Alateen meetings online or Alateen chat online. Being with other kids whose parents are dealing with a substance use disorder, some in recovery, some not, that also might be able to provide a really wonderful support system. But that would be secondary.
Thank you, Jerry. The next one is sharing. As an adult child of addiction, I used to think I stopped the generational cycle. But the truth is, PTSD of a parent impacts parenting. We all need healing and support, even those of us who escaped addiction and became resilient.
Yes, I think the answer is that person needs to get into herself or himself for any of the PTSD that has come along from generation to generation. We all need to heal. The 1-year-old who's lived in a chaotic family and the 54-year-old and the 34-year-old. If and especially if doing this work triggers for you, it's especially important to get help. Sometimes it's going to adult children of alcoholics, Al-Anon, that can help. But oftentimes you would probably want some specialized training. And remember that that when you have a new child, the child needs a lot that you never got. So it's important that you recognize what that is and help you to nurture your child better. Jerry?
Yeah, let me weigh into number one, excellent point. I couldn't agree with you more. But I'd also want to point out that, you know, my mentor, someone who has taught and trained and shaped me through the years, has often told me her belief is that it takes a couple of generations for healing completely to begin to take place. And that is if people are working on it. So, you know, congratulations for where you've come in terms of the healing. That is huge. And being able to look at it in terms of, you know, what are some other ways that I can heal? And it's a kind of thing that sometimes an issue or two will come up for someone, or they'll be reminded or something, or they'll see a pattern. And so work on it for your own health and well-being. And yet what a great example that is to kids and to grandkids who are growing up in this. So yeah, and it can be a lifelong journey, and certainly not a sentence, but a journey of continuing to grow, continuing to heal. And for me, you know, I always try to do that professionally, growing and healing, but I also try to do that personally. So working on both of those angles, right on. But I really hope that you stop and look at all and celebrate. Talk about that 7 C's. Celebrate me, to celebrate where you've come in this process, and a realization and a realistic plan in terms of moving forward. Awesome.
Thank you. The next question we received is, can someone discuss a little more about methods to address the trauma at the individual and community level?
Jerry, can I pass that on to you? I'm not sure I understood the question.
I think, gosh, Toby, we're almost out of time, and it's a fascinating question. What I would suggest, if you can, to attend the next webinar. The next webinar is going to be on celebrating families, and you're going to be hearing from clinicians and professionals from the courts, from social welfare, from the treatment field, from mental health, and what they're doing, from my humble perspective with Celebrating Families, is really beginning to change some of the dynamics in terms of communities healing from trauma, and we'll make sure that we can also address some of those individual issues. I'm just sorry that we ran out of time this session, but I will write that down and make sure that you get followed up and get some more answers for that, Toby. Great to hear from you. Thank you.
And Jerry and Sis, we do have more questions that have come in through the chat, but what we're going to do is we're capturing all the questions that are and comments that are coming in to develop a FAQ that we can share as a resource following the webinars as well, and also to provide you for future content on the other series. I'm going to read the next one. The next question was, I am wondering if you have any recommendations for specific strategies and goals in supporting infants and toddlers with in utero drug exposure and or parents struggling with addiction.
Well, that's a double question. Parents struggling with addiction, it would be whatever we would do for any other family where the parents are struggling with addiction. But you're talking about the children who have been damaged by drug use before birth. We don't know all the outcomes. There have been a lot of assumptions that are very negative about those children, but we don't really know the full damage or the least amount of damage that's going to happen for these babies. We are learning We are learning how to take care of them, as with any child who is born with drugs in them. But I think we have to leave that up to the professionals. Maybe, Jerry, maybe you work some people with anybody that does that work?
No, I'll have to do some research. All I know is that the presence of caring, nurturing adults and it is so vital there. And again, these are wonderful questions, and it's just a time crunch right now to be able to get in depth. We just can't do that now. But like Rox and Beth said, that we'll be able to come back and we'll get to see all these questions and incorporate them into the webinars that are coming up, the next 4 webinars.
Thank you, Jerry and Sis. And we will develop an FAQ with all these wonderful questions that came in. And I know we're at time, so we're just going to move on to a couple of reminders. As shared, a post-webinar survey is going to be distributed via SurveyMonkey, and we do ask if you could please share, feedback based on today's webinar and for future development efforts on future topics. Also, today's webinar is being recorded, along with the presentation slides will be distributed via the ovc-tta@jbsinternational.com inbox. Also, if interested in receiving NBCC and NADAC continuing education credits, please email us at that email, ovc-tta@jbsinternational.com. And the next upcoming webinar, as shared, session 2 with NACOA, is the Facilitating Recovery for Parents and Children Impacted by Addictions Using a Whole Family Recovery Strategies, next Wednesday from 1 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. A reminder will be sent via the inbox for registration if you have not signed up yet. And then later in July, we have the Generations United final webinar session, American Indian and Alaskan Native Grand Families, that's scheduled on July 7th. Forthcoming will be registration information for that one. Thank you so much to everyone who joins today's great webinar. Stay tuned. We'll be sharing resources.